Welcome and good morning to today's event, Lessons from Non-United Nations Peace Operations, Parallel Forces, and Regionally Led Peace Enforcement Missions, co-hosted by IPI and the French Ministry of the Armies. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jake Sherman. I'm the director of the Brian Urquhart Center for Peace Operations here at IPI. Partnerships between the UN and regional arrangements, including the African Union and the European Union, between the UN and regional economic communities and mechanisms like ECOWAS and IGAD, and with bilateral operations like Operation Barkhane, have become an increasingly important means of addressing complex peace and security challenges. Currently, 6 United Nations peacekeeping operations are deployed alongside missions by regional, sub-regional, or bilateral partners. In Darfur, the UN and the African Union jointly deploy the peacekeeping mission there, a unique hybrid arrangement. Nor are these partnerships limited to peacekeeping missions. UN political missions in Colombia, Guinea-Bissau, Iraq, Libya, and Somalia, and up until quite recently, Afghanistan, similarly work alongside regional deployments engaged in peacemaking, peacekeeping, and peace building. Some regional and sub-regional organizations are increasingly authorized by the Security Council to take on roles for which UN peacekeeping is ill-suited, including peace enforcement and counterterrorism operations like those deployed in areas affected by the Lord's Resistance Army and Boko Haram, and the joint force of the Group of Five for the Sahel. As the high-level independent panel on peace operations noted in 2015, the United Nations today sits at the nexus of a loose web of international, regional, and national capacities for preventing and managing conflict and sustaining peace. Navigating the regional dimensions of conflict and collaboration with regional partners will be an essential aspect of planning and deploying all UN peace operations in the future. More recently, as part of the Secretary General's Action for Peacekeeping initiative, member states and multilateral organizations, including the AU and the EU, committed to, quote, enhance collaboration and planning between the UN and relevant international, regional, and sub-regional organizations and arrangements, while recognizing the need for a clear delineation of roles between respective operations. To better understand how these operations can be made more effective, including how to navigate potential challenges, today's event features 2 panels on these topics, launching 2 IPI papers. The first by Alexandra Novoselov and Lisa Sharland on lessons from parallel forces, and the second by Paul Williams on lessons from AMISOM for other non-UN missions. Before we turn to the first panel, moderated by my colleague Namie Razza, I'm very pleased to welcome Laure Bansept from the French Ministry of the Armies to make opening remarks. Laure, you have the floor.
Distinguished guests, dear friends, I'm very happy and thankful to be here today. I'd like to thank IPI for organizing this seminar with the support of the French Ministry of the Armed Forces. I want to express my gratitude for your involvement in such matters necessary to preserve and develop our common work and thoughts concerning the benefits of the deployment of parallel forces and regionally led peace enforcement missions alongside UN peace operations. Since the end of the Cold War and the first parallel force set up in Yugoslavia in 1992 alongside the UN Protection Force, around 40 parallel forces operating alongside UN peace operation has been deployed in a bilateral or in a coalition context. In fact, for the last 30 years, the UN Security Council itself has increasingly authorized and supported a range of different parallel forces in order to deal with various challenges. The Security Council mainly resorts on these forces in cases where the United Nations lack the adequate capabilities to intervene, especially during a peace operation startup phase or during a particularly tense crisis situation. These parallel forces play and continue to play as we speak a critical role regarding, for example, security stabilization or capacity building. They turn out to be essential partners for UN peace operations helping to create the appropriate conditions for them to fulfill fully their mandates. They allow UN peace operations to concentrate on their mandate by drawing on the comparative strengths of different partners. When the need arises, the United Nations should be able to rely on dependable partnerships which allow peacekeeping to benefit from the particular but complementary expertise of each one of the actors, able and willing to get involved for peace. In this regard, the African Union mission in Somalia constitutes an example of a partnership peacekeeping. In this case, the collaboration between the African Union and the UN, as well as other partners, offers us useful lessons, which can help to conceptualize future partnerships. The development of the partnership between the United Nations and the African Union represents a unique opportunity to deepen their cooperation in order to better address future crisis situations, especially in Africa. In this regard, France fully endorses and supports the concept of African-led peace operations, which we have been collectively working on since 2016. As I mentioned earlier, the deployment of parallel forces particularly finds meaning when a security situation or a humanitarian situation rapidly deteriorates and poses an immediate threat for the stabilization of a region that no other actor will be able to address on a very short notice. For instance, France has been deploying its armed force on several of these occasions, recently in Mali and in the Central African Republic, with the support of the host country and of the international community. These operations were aiming at responding quickly and effectively to crises in order to stabilize the state and create favorable conditions for the protection of civilians. These operations were also conducted in close coordination with the deployment of African-led peace support operation, MISMA in Mali and MISCA in CAR. This kind of collaboration played a key role that enabled the development of the United Nations peace operations and the beginning of a long-run stabilization process. Indeed, France does not intend to act as a global policeman, and its actions can only be considered as temporary and complementary to the ones of other partners involved in the restoration of peace, primarily the United Nations. I understand some observers believe parallel forces may cause interference, but to us it shows France cares and is willing to take political and military risks to help restore peace. If the action of such parallel forces find meaning in the early phases of crisis management, their involvement also directly contributes to the crisis settlement and the correct implementation of peace agreements on the long term. We believe the development of partnerships represent an opportunity which can allow us to collectively shape a more reactive, effective, and performant peacekeeping, able to face the emergence of new challenges. It may be imperfect, but it is sometimes the best or the only solution. Numerous challenges remain, and I'm confident that the discussions that we will have today with our panel will help us to address the challenges and opportunities of parallel forces operating alongside UN peace operations. And I'm also convinced that this seminar will help make our collective action stronger and more effective in all these aspects. So I wish today's talk would be fruitful, and then the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Laure, and good morning to everybody. Welcome to the first session of this policy forum. My name is Namie Razza. I am a senior fellow here at IPI at the Brian Urquhart Center for Peace Operations and the head of the Protection of Civilians program. I will be moderating this discussion on lessons from forces operating in parallel to UN peace operations. Historically, UN peacekeeping operations have been limited in scope and in resources. They operate under specific principles, limited use of force, consent, impartiality. They implement specific mandates that result from compromises at the Security Council, and they often have limited capacities and means. They often often face structural issues related to command and control, varied levels of performance and commitment of troop contributing countries, bureaucratic impediments, and constraints dictated by fragile political processes. As a result, they are not always fit for purpose, and certainly not the unique panacea to respond to multifaceted and acute crises and to neutralize all possible threats to stabilization and peace. UN peace operations operate in increasingly complex environments, and in such contexts, the deployment of other types of forces in parallel to peacekeeping operations can complement the contribution of UN peacekeeping operations. From the no-fly zone enforced by NATO in former Yugoslavia to the G5 Sahel Joint Force in Mali, 40 forces were deployed in parallel to UN peace operations, and currently there are parallel forces operating alongside 6 peace operations. As calls for partnerships and comprehensive approaches increase, there is a general assumption that additional forces are a good thing. They offer what peace operations don't have. They multiply forces, they provide different entry points and increase leverage. They bring comparative advantages with different types of mandates, equipment, capabilities, modus operandi, and posture. They can fill the gaps and help responding to crises in a decisive way. In Mali, for example, some would argue that the Barkhane operation, the G5 Sahel Joint Force, and MINUSMA all work towards the same objective in different ways. But they also raise concerns of duplication and can create challenges to peace operations. They can pursue competing goals, but deployments also present inherent risks of confusion and conflation with the peacekeeping operations in polarized environments, especially when the parallel force is involved in the conflict or in counterterrorism. The high-level independent panel on peace operations itself recommended to maintain a clear division of labor and distinction of roles in such configurations. So today I am thrilled to launch the latest report of IPI, Partners and Competitors, Military Forces Operating in Parallel to UN Peace Operations. The report offers a typology and an analysis of parallel forces, insights into the challenges and opportunities these parallel forces present to UN peace operations, and recommendations for the design and the planning of future parallel forces. So my colleagues Alexandra Novoselov and Lisa Sharland, the authors of the report, will present their work, and Ms. Naomi Miyashita from the Department of Peace Operations and Colonel Decombe from the Permanent Mission of France to the UN will share additional perspectives on the topic. Dr. Alexandra Novoselov is a non-resident fellow at IPI and at the New York University Center on International Cooperation. She's also research associate at the Center to Study in Paris, and she has extensively worked on UN peacekeeping and Security Council-related issues and published numerous books, policy papers, and reports. Ms. Lisa Sharland heads the international program at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. She's also a non-resident fellow at the Stimson Center. Her research focuses on Australia's engagement in UN peacekeeping operations and UN peace operations reform, and she was also the defense policy advisor at the Permanent Mission of Australia to the UN in the past. Ms. Naomi Miyashita is a senior political affairs officer at the UN Department of Peace Operations. In this role, she covers protection, civil affairs, and sustaining peace for the Policy and Best Practices Service. And Colonel Richard Decombe is a military advisor of a permanent mission of France to the UN, where he advises the ambassador on UN affairs. And he was also, before that, the head of office at the UN desk, a joint staff in Paris. So without waiting more, I will give the floor to Lisa first, and then Alexandra, so that we can provide an overview of their work. Lisa?
Thank you, Namie. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a delight to be back at IPI here in New York, as always, and a privilege to be part of the work that I think is going on peace operations reform being carried out by IPI. So we're delighted to have this paper available today as part of our research. Before making a few brief remarks, I'd like to offer particular thanks to the French Ministry of the Armed Forces for their support of this project, the reviewers, some of whom are in the room, of the paper, and in particular those that we interviewed as part of our research in Mali to inform this paper. As has already been mentioned by some of the speakers this morning, the deployment of MINUSMA, I think, prompted a number of questions about the way that sort of parallel forces conduct their work alongside UN peace operations. And we thought it was a topic that was worthy of further examination. And I think in many ways, I won't speak for Alexandra, but certainly I was quite interested and in some ways surprised to see the history of parallel forces over the last 30 years, in that this is not a new phenomena by any means. And as has been mentioned, in the typology that we looked at, we came across over 40 different types of parallel forces over the last 30 years. So the concept's not a new one. So briefly before going on, I thought it worthwhile to give you a sense of how we defined what a parallel force is, and I'm sure there will be some disputes in this definition, but for the purposes of our research, we defined it as an international, predominantly military or police operation deployed alongside a UN peace operation. So that is either a special political mission or a peacekeeping mission, with authorisation or recognition from the Security Council through a resolution or presidential statement. So there are a number of different types of operations perhaps that fall outside the scope of that definition that we haven't quite captured in this paper, but that was the focus of our examination. We did note that the parallel force may be referenced directly in the resolution or presidential statement, or indirectly. And again, that was quite interesting in our research to come across. But there are some grey areas there, and one of the things that we don't go into, for instance, is looking at the role of civilian missions, for instance, alongside UN peace operations. So it's worthwhile stating that up front. So as has been mentioned, we start off sort of in the former Yugoslavia, looking at the resolution authorising a no-fly zone. And throughout the 1990s, we then see in Liberia, for instance, with the work of ECOWAS, the deployment of UN political missions, and then right through up to now with the deployment of MINUSMA in Mali and 5 other what we would term parallel forces. I think it's fair to say that no two parallel forces are the same. And so while we can draw some broad lessons from this, I think we need to be conscious of the context of the different missions and what we can draw from them whenever we're looking at this going forward. So briefly, we identified in terms of context 4 different sort of typologies or classifications for parallel forces. First of all, and this is outlined in the paper in Table 1, I should note, is a military stabilisation operation. So that is a parallel force that may fight wars or undertake military, counterinsurgency or counter-terrorism operations that are beyond the remit or capabilities of UN peace operations. So in this case, you can look back to the no-fly zone that we were referring to in the former Yugoslavia. You could look at what's happening with what happened with ISAF in Afghanistan, of course deployed alongside the UN political mission UNAMA, and you can look at what's happening in Mali at the moment with Operation Barkhane and the G5 Sahel Force. The second one we identified was crisis response. So that is a mission that intervenes to provide reinforcement when there is a crisis that a UN peace operation lacks capability to respond to. And to provide an example of this, we were referring to what happened in Timor, for instance, with the deployment of Interfet and then the International Stabilisation Force, or Operation Artemis in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The third one that we identify is an insurance or a deterrence force. So that is a force that is effectively on standby or prepared to intervene when a UN peace operation is unable to do so. So providing a bit of insurance in terms of rapid response should things or a crisis develop. And in this instance, we identified U4 in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the International Stabilisation Force in Timor, and many other examples. And then the final one that we identify as one is a mission looking at capacity building. So in particular here, we were highlighting missions that are deployed to undertake security sector reform, for instance. And a number of these were led by the European Union, for instance, alongside peace operations. Then the next thing that we've gone through is looked at the different types of actors. And we categorised these in 3 ways. First of all, we looked at the fact that there were a number of bilateral deployments. And these have largely, I think a lot of the burden sharing on these have been undertaken by the French considerably in supporting UN peace operations in this area, perhaps with the addition of the United Kingdom in Sierra Leone as the other case study that we refer to. And then we were also, in terms of the actors, the second category that we looked at was regional organisations. And we have a range here all the way from the Commonwealth of Independent States through to the European Union, the African Union, ECOWAS, and even NATO. And then finally, and perhaps I think the one that provides a bit of interest in terms of how they came about, were the multinational parallel forces. that were deployed. In some cases led by the US, in the case of Somalia and Haiti, in Australia, in Timor, and France in Rwanda. And across all these different actors, there are different rationales in terms of the reasons for deploying. They may be humanitarian imperatives. It may be because of spheres of influence that countries have a particular interest in remaining engaged and leading a parallel force. There may be geographic links and so on. And again, these may overlap for different contexts. What we did find is that the majority of deployments were undertaken by Western states. So 4 of the 5 P5 members have been involved in leading parallel forces. Yet, and as I'm sure we will hear to some extent, particularly in the second panel, this has really started to shift in the last 2 decades with the work being undertaken by the African Union and sub-regional organisations, which what we found was that really presents a whole set of different challenges to what some parallel forces have faced in the past. So very briefly, in addition to that, we look at the way that these parallel forces were indeed authorised or recognised. So we distinguish between those that were explicitly authorised by the Security Council and use that language, and those that were simply recognised, perhaps through welcoming or acknowledgement in the Council products. In some cases, parallel forces were deployed because a member state expressed an interest in leading an operation. In other cases, it was at the prompting of the UN Secretary-General or other UN members. And again, I should note here that the language used by the Council has also varied in terms of some of the resolutions explicitly refer to the member states involved by name, for instance, French forces in some cases. In other instances, it's rather vague and simply refers to member states. And again, I think this comes down to the complexity and the politics around not only parallel forces, but UN peace operations more broadly. And the final point I'd make on that is we also go into some of the reporting mechanisms, and I'm sure Alexandra will come back to that a little bit in terms of accountability. But again, these are varied in terms of how different missions are required to report back to the Security Council. So the final thing I'll briefly go into in terms of our report is we look a little bit at why are there parallel forces? Why don't countries opt to deploy personnel into UN peace operations? Now, I think a big consideration there is some of the tasks that are being undertaken are beyond the scope of UN peace operations, and that has indeed been acknowledged. But we identified 3 different sort of rationales for deploying parallel forces, and in some cases, all of these may apply. First of all, to respond rapidly and robustly to a crisis situation. I'm sure most people in this room know that it takes a considerable amount of time to deploy a UN peace operation. The Hippo report acknowledged at the time about 3 years ago that it was about 6 months roughly. Yet often situations, if civilians are under threat, if there's a humanitarian imperative, require a response much more rapidly than in 6 months. So that's been one of the prompts for deploying a parallel force to intervene quickly. Member states are often able to mobilise those forces much more quickly as opposed to through the UN system in some instances. We've also in particular seen this type of response in instances perhaps where there's been a UN political mission deployed, as was the case in Timor-Leste, and there was a need for a security intervention, and that's what we saw 20 years ago when Interfet went in, for instance. And then we saw a UN peacekeeping operation deploy shortly thereafter, with the parallel force having provided some of that time and bridging gap, basically, for the UN to generate the necessary mechanisms for the UN peacekeeping operation to be deployed. The second rationale we identify is to serve national interests. And in many instances, the reason for a parallel force intervening, in the first instance, has effectively been to protect a country's nationals, to intervene, to evacuate them. But what has been interesting in some of those instances is then that those countries have remained in place to continue contributing to responding to the security situation on the ground. And I think this reflects broader sort of multilateral interests in supporting the system and broader sort of, I think, engagement in terms of realising that the intervention needs to go beyond that sort of narrow initial motivation. Similarly, if we point to the EU's engagement, a lot of this has been driven, I think, by their policies in terms of their engagement in terms of support of multinational responses, but also similarly in terms of developments in North Africa at the moment and concerns about the security situation there. And then the final rationale that we look at in the paper is a desire to operate outside of UN peace operations. And I think this is one of the ones that presents perhaps one of the more complex areas in terms of the way that the UN engages in this issue. Many of the parallel forces that we looked at in the paper were more advanced, perhaps you could say, in some areas militarily. And I think their deployment outside of the UN system might reflect wider reservations about some of the capabilities of UN peace operations, concerns about safety and security, control over military assets, and sometimes operating outside that system can offer more control. We have seen, we saw this debate, for instance, play out in Rwanda in the 1990s in terms of the deployment, whether there was discussion in the Council and disagreement about reinforcing the UN mission or deploying Operation Turquoise. And similarly, I think we also saw this in Lebanon in terms of the debate about actually reinforcing the strategic military cell when a number of European countries deployed. So while there wasn't a parallel force there were reforms to the UN system to address some concerns. And again, the Cruz report more recently and so on. So that sort of sets out the framework for our analysis in the paper. And at this point in time, I think with that in mind, I might hand over to my colleague Alexandra to go through some of those challenges and potential opportunities emerging from parallel deployments.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for brilliantly presenting the framework of our study. Good morning. It's always good to be back at IPI. I would like to thank IPI and Jack Sherman for inviting us. I would like to thank the French Ministry of Armed Forces for funding this research and for convening the seminar on this very important topic that I think was never really researched so far. So I will present some of the challenges that we have identified for those forces operating in parallel to UN peace operations and for UN operations to work alongside those forces. Talking about the challenges is talking about the comparative advantages of those various formats, on the pros and cons of having those forces operate in the same theaters, on contexts where having those can be most efficient for both stakeholders, and on how to use respective assets in the best possible way to save money and efforts. Because organizations and coalitions are different by nature, have different interests and goals, UN peace operations and parallel forces are often guided by different motivations and compete for visibility. That has, of course, an impact on the way these forces will achieve their mandate and cooperate on the ground. And therefore, it will have also an impact on the effectiveness of the overall intervention of the so-called international community. The lack of a common vision at the strategic level in headquarters translates inevitably into a lack of mutual understanding and communication of respected means, capabilities, and limitations of UN peace operations and parallel forces on the ground. In the numerous field missions I have visited over the years, there are these strong mutual misunderstandings are always present, and they are often more damaging than we think. The division of labor that should be at the heart of those multiple deployments is often not clear enough. In the report, we have identified a number of challenges in terms of coordination at the strategic level and on the ground, in terms of information sharing, in terms of sharing of capacities and capabilities, in terms of confusion over respective mandates, and consequences of working with parallel counterterrorism forces. At the heart of all those challenges is the issue of the impartiality of UN peacekeeping and the issue of the capacity of the UN to sustain the consequences of the closeness with a parallel force that may have different objectives. that issue of impartiality was continuously raised by by a number of our interlocutors, whether we are talking about information sharing, about co-location, or about perceptions of local populations over the forces, the various forces deployed. And the more robust the parallel force will be, the more those issues will be acute. And the impartiality of the UN will be therefore at stake. And all the more so when the UN mission operates alongside a counterterrorism force. Because a UN operation will always be less equipped than the parallel force, it is concerned to keep its impartiality that allows it to work with all parties to the conflict, and which is, in essence, its added value. A lack of distinction could be instrumentalized by those seeking to undermine the peace or the political process by targeting the UN mission, which is always the weakest element of the international presence. To address this risk, the UN has chosen either to keep its distance from the parallel force, and this has been the case in Afghanistan, for example, and in Iraq, or to cooperate with it fully, and that was the case in Côte d'Ivoire and the Central African Republic, or to cooperate and coordinate with it on a case-by-case basis. And this is the case in Mali. For this reason, the UN has often tried to keep its distance from counterterrorism forces in particular. In Iraq, the Security Council delinked the resolution renewing UNAMI's mandate and the one renewing the authorization of the multinational forces since 2005. In Afghanistan, UNAMA started in 2006 and 2007 to systematically monitor civilian casualties, including those by ISAF. And this is, I think, what the UN is currently looking at in the case of Mali. With that same intention of keeping its distances, the UN has devised a number of instruments to make parallel forces comply with international humanitarian and human rights law. The other concern of the UN is looking at the level of cooperation and operational overlap that could take place with parallel forces. And the level of risk that blue helmets can be dragged into operations for which they would have not been given the adequate means nor enough political support. And the risk is greater when some contributing countries, of course, feel closer operationally, in spirit and in military training, to the parallel forces or to the parallel force that than of the UN operation. And when the UN operation becomes a sort of service provider to the parallel force. As said by our moderator today in one of her last reports, there is a need to clearly distinguish between kinetic military operations aiming at counterterrorism and multidimensional peacekeeping operations aiming at supporting the peace process and protecting the population. End of quote. So looking at the challenges does not mean that these parallel deployments don't have a number of positive elements, such as additional and niche capacities, element of military robustness and of political support. We tend to often forget the key issue of the political support in all this. And of course, building, as it was said before, building capacity and training. But the various stakeholders deciding on the creation and the deployment of those forces have to make stronger efforts at making them less competitors to UN peace operations and more genuine partners. But for this, of course, both have to acknowledge and to understand their mutual differences. So I only have 1 minute left, so I will go directly to some of the recommendations that we have tried to put forward. I will try to summarize them. Of course, first we recommended to update, to clarify, and to revise the 2008 Capstone Doctrine to ensure that UN peacekeepers are not deployed in contexts that requires more offensive action and where a multinational force or a coalition of the willing would be better suited. We recommended also, in order to have this closeness and more coordination between forces, that maybe some of the assessments that are done would be, in terms of planning, in terms of deploying, would be made jointly between the leadership of those forces. And if the parallel force is not deployed yet, at least those discussions could happen at the headquarters level. One idea that we put forward in order to develop some mechanism to engage between those various forces on a continuous basis, on a regular and informal basis, would be to have to develop some mechanism within the Military Staff Committee or within the Security Council Working Group on Peacekeeping Operations. There needs also to have stronger assessment on the pros and cons of co-location, of co-locating, and I think that dialogue have to happen between the leadership of those forces. We have to put in place also stronger oversight mechanism to strengthen the accountability of parallel forces. We don't have time now to go through some of the mechanisms that we studied in the report, but there's a need for a greater accountability of parallel forces. And finally, we thought that maybe the C-34 could request a lessons learned exercise in order to look more deeply into the deployment of those parallel forces. To conclude, the report that we have written is a plea for a stronger cooperation between all stakeholders involved in crisis management, whether at headquarters or in the field. Because after all the money spent come from the same pockets, those of our taxpayer money. And there needs to be a greater accountability on that front also. So we need to have a clearer division of labor between various forces deployed, with ideally the UN providing the de-escalation and long-term stabilization mechanism through peacekeeping, and a region, a military alliance, or a coalition of the willing providing, with their own funding, robust interventions when required. A division of labor built on comparative advantages and respective strengths. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Alexandra, and thank you, Lisa, for this presentation of the contents of your report. I think the report really demonstrates the diversity of all the parallel forces that exist and have existed, and the wide range of parallel forces that you have documented. And you really provide useful typologies in the report according to different categories. I really highly recommend the tables in the report that really list the 40 parallel forces over the last 2 decades, and I think it's a very important work. You raised the challenges, of course, and most of them actually bring us back to the question of impartiality. I think there's this eternal dilemma between the cooperation but also the need for a clear delineation between parallel forces and peacekeeping operations, and I'm sure we'll continue this debate with our other panelists. So maybe I will turn to Colonel Decombe. France has deployed several operations in parallel to UN peace operations, and I think the report describes France as having contributed to the vast majority of parallel forces. So it would be interesting to have your perspectives on the comparative advantage of such deployments and the potential challenges that they can raise.
Thank you, Namie. Good morning, everybody, and I would like to starting to thank Jake and IPI for this invitation to this meeting this morning and giving us the opportunity to talk about peacekeeping operation issues, including the other security actors. Even if in terms of gender balance, I'm feeling a bit in minority, but with so nice and expert, nice people and expert, I think I will be able to do my speech anyway. My background very quickly is more focused on Africa, where I've been deployed in operation, and where I've been deployed as well as a defense attaché in Ghana, Accra, and in Nairobi, Kenya. Regarding my last deployment in operation, it was in MINUSMA between August 2017 and January 2018 as the Chief U5 in the Force HQ in Bamako. U5 is one of the office of the HQ in charge of planning, of course, but in charge also with the relation between all the different actors, EUTM, Barkhane, the FAMA, and the civilian pillars of the mission. I would like to start by, when I was a young officer, I've been taught that before speaking or writing on any subject, a definition of the different terms should be made. So when I started working on my speech, it took some time before realizing that the term parallel forces referred to Barkhane, the joint force of G5 Sahel, or anyone. Because my understanding is that parallel forces, this term parallel is not really appropriate. Because my understanding of two parallel entities or organization, they don't have any contact, they don't have any relations, and they don't share views, analysis, or cross-cutting issues. And that's not what happened on the ground today between, let's say, Barkhane and MINUSMA. The second point is that when you talk about parallel organization, you could understand, and it was first my understanding, that they are both heading in the same direction. Meaning what? Meaning wanting to reach the same objective with quite the same mandate or not? Of course, it's not the case. But once again, my opinion is that parallel is very confusing. And the last reason is that when you say that when you talk about an official and formal organization, and you talk about parallel organization, you could understand that other actors are doing unofficial action or undercover action, you see? So it's not very clear, and in fact, it's absolutely not what happened on the ground. So that's why I have a little problem with the term of parallel. Let's have an example with Barkhane in Mali. In all the resolution of the Security Council, you have this paragraph, operational paragraph number 42, saying that Barkhane can use all the means to provide support to the MINUSMA in case of imminent threat or any imminent in case of important crisis. So it's written in a Security Council resolution, so it's very clear. In addition, you should know that you probably know, that both mission MINUSCA and MINUSMA have signed a technical agreement with France to explain exactly the different modalities Barkhane is supposed to provide to this mission. So nothing is hidden, nothing is not clear, and the relations between Barkhane and those two big missions acting in a very difficult environment are very clear. So as a conclusion of this very first part, I would say that the various security actors in the Sahel are more complementary, and I would recommend that rather talking about parallel forces, maybe we should talk about partners or partners forces. I would like now to shift on another issue regarding the cooperation and the different cooperation mechanism that exist between the partners and the MINUSMA, for example. Of course, there is still room for improvement, sure. What exists today is not perfect, but it's already an achievement because you don't decide snapping in your fingers that, okay, this kind of national FAMA armed forces, a national-led operation like Barkhane, a regional force like Joint Force G5 Sahel, or EUTM, which has another kind of mandate. You don't decide like this from today or for tomorrow. Okay, you have to work together, you have to coordinate, and you have to act very efficiently, please. It's not the way it happens. They have, of course, different cultures, different procedures, and it takes time before achieving to working together. Regarding MINUSMA, I would say that what is in place is quite good. You have liaison officer from MINUSMA to the FAMA and to other forces, and even MINUSMA is receiving liaison officers from other partners. So on a daily basis, those forces are at least informed on what other partners are doing. As an example, in Bamako, you have 3 liaison officers from the MINUSMA dedicated to the Joint Force G5 Sahel. On a very formal manner, you have what is called in Bamako Instance de Coordination en Mali, coordination forum in Mali, gathering all the 5 force commanders, Barkhane, MINUSMA, Joint Force G5 Sahel, FAMA, and EUTM. And during this very formal meeting, they share information, they share their own analysis or vision on what is going on and what should be done on the ground. They also do planning and coordination work, and they also try to adopt and to adjust their own procedures, operational procedures on the ground. And then so every 2 months you have this kind of formal meeting, and every month at the staff level, staff officers within the different operation forces work on implementing the decision that have been made during these formal meetings. Finally, you also have many meetings between MINUSMA and the FAMA, trying to work closer and to plan coordinated, not joint, but coordinated operation. And it works. You have MINUSMA contingent units on the ground in the sectors working or carrying out coordinated patrols with the FAMA. As example, you have a major operation in the center of Mali, allowing the civilian pillars of the mission, of the MINUSMA, to deploy and to do their job in this region in coordination with the FAMA. So there is really a complementary role of the different security actors with MINUSMA. It's a mutual benefit for all of them. Regarding Barkhane, Barkhane is very happy with what MINUSMA is doing. Of course, it's not the same mandate, it's not the same level of operational expertise, that's okay, but we should not compare two different forces and two different mandates. What MINUSMA is doing in securing the securization of the main axis, providing security and control of a huge area of the Malian territory, providing force protection to the base, the camp base of where MINUSMA and Barkhane are sharing the base, is what Barkhane has not to take into consideration, so that Barkhane is able to focus more on its counter-terrorism mandate. So for Barkhane is very happy with what MINUSMA is doing. And regarding MINUSMA, I guess because of this operational paragraph 42 I quoted at the beginning of my speech, I think the presence of Barkhane is providing confidence to the MINUSMA contingent, and because they perfectly know that when they will carry out some mission outside their camp, Barkhane is able to provide strong assets and direct support to them in case of problem. My last part is more a personal reflection regarding what peacekeeping operation could do on a better way. They cannot do everything, but I think a strong focus should be made to the capacity building of local forces, armed forces and security forces. That should be really one of the first priority, because providing support, providing assistance is the basic job of a US peacekeeping operation, of course. But I think in complementary with what is done on a bilateral basis between Mali and some other countries, MINUSMA should be more involved in the development of capacity building. Why? Because having some FAMA or Malian security forces stronger and autonomous will allow the return of the sovereignty of states, and will allow a transition and a withdrawal of MINUSMA at the end. So this is, once again, it's a personal view. It's not so official, but I wanted to share this reflection with you. And the very last point, another objective should be high in the scale of the priorities, is the one concerning the Madame Novoselov was talking about perception, the strategic communication of the mission. It's incredible as the population had no idea of what MINUSMA is doing, confusing the mandate with Barkhane, and always complaining because MINUSMA is not doing enough to the benefit of the FAMA, blah, blah, blah. So there is a real problem in terms of strategic communication, and strategic communication is not only spending one afternoon in a school and explaining to young students what are the blue helmets. No, you have to reach the political leaders and also the local leaders. As a conclusion, I think in the Sahel, in Mali, but more broadly in the Sahel, the situation is very difficult. There is room from any actors on the ground. And once again, I would like to encourage all the current partners to work more on a more complementary manner. But what is done already today is not sufficient, but is already satisfactory.
Thank you, Colonel. Thanks for highlighting these terminology issues and also the fact that we could think about other terms in terms of partnership rather than competitors, and it's at the core of the report. I think you highlighted that the structures and processes are needed and to put them in place, it takes time, it takes efforts, it takes energy and planning. Strategic communication could certainly benefit from increased efforts in this regard. So I guess it's time now to turn to Naomi, because the Action for Peacekeeping initiative really insists on partnerships and calls for increased partnerships. So how do parallel forces would fit in this call? What should be done to make sure that their deployment is indeed complementary and will really ensure more cooperation and partnerships and avoid competition? That would be an interesting point. Thanks.
Thank you, Namie, and thank you to IPI, Jake, and to the French Ministry of Armed Forces as well for inviting me to speak at this event. And maybe just on that point you said, Namie, I mean, I don't think we see MINUSMA and Barkhane and the G5 Sahel force in Mali necessarily in competition. I think it's quite clear that they have different strengths and they operate They operate in a complementary way together, I think. So I would just maybe point that out. So I'm going to draw on the findings of a project that we are undertaking in the Department of Peace Operations. It's called the Adapting Peace Operations to Complex Conflict Environments. And it's trying to look at these kinds of conflicts in which there is no clear path to a comprehensive political solution, where there are a number of armed actors operating, including terrorists and organized criminal groups, and when there's a complex web of regional and international interests in the conflict that lend a sort of a new dimension to how the international community needs to engage in order to resolve those conflicts. And there are a number of course, those we're thinking in these contexts of conflicts such as Mali, such as Afghanistan, such as Somalia, Iraq, and so on, where parallel operations are, I think, a key feature. And maybe before going into that, I would just note that I think we have a very long, as you've noted in your really informative report, Lisa and Alexandra, a long and quite positive experience with parallel operations to date. And in the Congo with Operation Artemis, with the EU4, Sierra Leone, and elsewhere. These are all environments in which we've had parallel operations that have come in at a particular time in response to particular needs, and in the context of UN objectives that were set by the Security Council. And certainly when I was a young officer in the Congo in 2004, Operation Artemis was really, I think, seen as really saving the day in Bunia. And I think it's a credit to the French and to the Europeans that they were able to mobilize and step in when the UN peacekeeping operation was really not able to respond to a very fast-moving crisis situation. So I think that there are a lot of positive examples, and I think part of what worked in the past was really that clarity in the overall strategic intent, a clear separation of roles, and the time-bound nature of the intervention that these parallel operations undertook. And I think those are much appreciated. But I think today we're seeing a step change in the nature of conflict. I've just highlighted three features of the complexity that we're facing today. And I think in terms of the parallel operations, what makes it different is that the operations of today, whether it's a Barkhane or a G5 Sahel or an ISAF or an AMISOM, are basically trying to change the strategic landscape of the conflict by trying to defeat opponents. And so it's not as self-contained a situation as what we've seen in the past. And they are indeed open-ended interventions with, I think, fair to say, unknown trajectories and unforeseen consequences, in which force is being used as an end in itself, and not necessarily anchored in a political process. That is the case with robust keeping, and was the case until, was the case traditionally in the 2000s with multidimensional peacekeeping operations. And so what happens, I think, in these conflict environments is that these parallel operations shape the space that others may have for alternative approaches. And I think they, to some extent, limit the avenues for political engagements with a diverse set of armed groups. And what happens is that the actors on the ground, on all sides, are constantly shifting and changing their posture in reaction to each other. And of course, we see in Mali, Katiba Masina, for example, is much more nimble and agile and adaptive than a clunky peacekeeping operation like MINUSMA, even with all the specialized capabilities that the mission is now starting to acquire. So I think there are three implications from this that I would highlight. I think the first one is that the onus has to be really on a constant dialogue and strategic coordination, something that has already been raised between the interveners. And I think part of that has to be an honest and frank self-assessment as to whether the approach being applied is working or not. And so I think in that sense, Alexandra and Lisa talk about the role of pivotal states, and I think that that is incredibly important in these environments where the UN is no longer the sort of the primus inter pares that is coordinating and sort of bringing people together. Now the center of political gravity lies elsewhere, and therefore that dialogue and that strategic coordination, I think, is really important. Of course, and on the operational side as well, and I think the Colonel has highlighted the ways in which that is already happening on the ground. So in a place like Mali, I think we need to be constantly, all of us as actors in Mali need to be constantly asking ourselves, what the progression of the conflict has been in the north, in the center, in the region, and I think we need to be constantly sort of critically evaluating whether the interventions that we're taking, the approaches that we're taking are having the desired effect or not. I think that's an important discussion that needs to happen on a constant basis. I'm not saying this, I'm not implying that, kinetic operations are not appropriate or should not take place. It's not at all what I'm saying. It's not a zero-sum game. I think the international community has a number of levers at its disposal, ranging from coercion to persuasion. And I think the way in which we balance these different tools and combine these different tools needs to be done in a thoughtful manner, and one in which we're constantly evaluating the impact that we're having. The second, I think, implication that I would raise that stems from the Adapting project and the research that we've done in that context is the need to question whether stability in itself is a good enough long-term objective in the conflict environments where we're all collectively operating. So, I mean, we may, through peace enforcement operations or counterterrorism operations, be effective at controlling, limiting, and containing the threat posed by terrorist groups. But if we don't address the underlying factors that give rise to radicalization or that make individuals pledge allegiance to some of these groups, then we're not really fundamentally fixing the problem. And I think, what we've seen across a number of theaters is that sometimes there is a dynamic that kicks in whereby the coalitions and the alliances that are needed to establish counter-terrorist operations or enforcement operations may at the same time benefit certain segments of the society, may benefit elites, or may have the sort of unintended consequence of also benefiting the very networks that we're trying to dismantle, criminal networks and so on. And so I think the second and third order effects of operations that we undertake need to be carefully assessed, and that perspective on whether we're operating to stabilize in the short term or reach a sustainable peace in the long term is one that needs to be considered. The third implication, I think, for the UN and for our operations is that I think we need to be very clear about where we add value and where we have a strength and comparative advantage. And I think for peacekeeping, for peace operations, I think it lies in the political role that we can play, the good officers' role, the support to political processes, implementation of agreements, and so on, and also ability to protect civilians, which, I mean, still faces a lot of challenges, of course, but I think we have made incredible progress in this year's and a key anniversary year on POC. We've made incredible progress, and I think we by and large are not so bad at it, all things considered. And so if we want to be able to preserve, to uphold those two comparative advantages, I think there are a number of things that we need to consider. One is that, there's been a lot of talk about impartiality. I think, impartiality remains one of the three principles of peacekeeping operations. And I think to the extent that we can uphold it and be seen to be impartial, that will allow us to have that space to be able to operate on the political front as well as on the protection front. And it is difficult when we're mandated to support parallel operations, as is the case with the G5. And when we need to coordinate and collaborate with counterterrorism operations such as Barkhane, which is actually a matter of operational necessity. And if we didn't have that support from Barkhane, we wouldn't be able to really exist in Mali either. So it's difficult. And I think the answer lies in, the issue that's been raised already a number of times, a clear delineation of roles, and to the extent possible, a distinction of roles. And I think maybe, just to kind of wind down a little bit, there are a number of things I think we can do to uphold that. One, I think, in the context of the G5 Sahel joint force, the SG has called on the establishment of a separate support office on a number of occasions that is funded through the assessed budget and that is independent of MINUSMA. And I think that would go some way to separating out, MINUSMA and allowing MINUSMA to concentrate on what is its core business. Second, I think, a lesson from UNAMA is around, which Lisa and Alessandro also mentioned in the report, is around human rights reporting. And I think, we have a role in reporting on human rights violations. I think we should, to the extent that we can, do that in a balanced way. It also gives us credibility vis-a-vis actors, parties to conflict, and also helps us, address violations that may be going on. A third area is HRDDP. And as we become more involved in the business of supporting other armed forces, we need to also get better at using that as a way of encouraging them to adopt stronger human rights and code of conduct and compliance with human rights and different codes of conduct. Maybe just one final word. I just wanted to react to one recommendation that's in the report on the need to revise the capstone doctrine of peacekeeping. And we went through this reflection early this year or last year, also because the Santos Cruz report recommended the same thing. And I think where we landed was that while it's true that the peacekeeping realities of today are very different, and we see, whether it's in the Congo with the FIB or whether it's MINUSMA, a stretching and a pressuring on those principles, we concluded that those three principles are still a valid framework for our operations, and that we continue to stand by, and that they actually provide sufficient scope to accommodate some of the more kind of outer limits of peacekeeping environments that we see in different countries. But we do feel that, especially now after the restructuring, that there is a need to rethink a little bit about how we conceive of peace operations as a whole, and how the principles may be applied, to a broader spectrum of operations as well. Maybe I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Naomi. Thanks for stressing the importance of parallel forces is to really pursue a modular approach in the complex environments we face, and for giving concrete recommendations on how to distinguish roles and operate this delineation of labor that we discussed. We have 20 minutes for the Q&A, so I really want to give a chance to the audience to ask questions to the panel. So please, if you want to take the floor, I will take 3 questions to start off, and please introduce yourself and your organization, and then we'll have a chance to get back to panelists. So I have Charles, and then just in the middle, we have a lot of questions, actually.
Thanks very much, everyone, for a terrific panel. I congratulate you on the report. I've read it. It's fabulous. It's a great contribution. Like you said, a gap-filling thing, I really think, for academics, humble academics like me, it's a really great resource. Thanks. It seems to me there's 2 different key sets of questions. One is about what peacekeeping should look like in future and how we should deal with these kind of ideas and relationships in the future, but there's a set of pressing questions about how to deal with the current constellations in place. So given you focused on Mali and the field work, my question's on that, and it's really about the local level and local perceptions, because we've talked quite a bit about how to coordinate things at a more strategic level here at headquarters, but also in the field. But at the local level, during a recent trip to Mali myself, in Gao, there was a clear escalation whereby the MINUSMA police responded to an incident. They were overmatched. The force responded. They were overmatched. And very soon after, Barkhane responded. So to people in the town, it's very difficult for them to dissociate the presence. So this issue of local perception, I guess my question, therefore, is whatever there is de jure, de facto, people see a very close relationship. When the politics are so fraught, that's potentially problematic to the UN's effectiveness, but also the credibility in Naomi's key point around the political process. How can the UN have that impartial role in guiding a primacy of politics if they're kind of undermined in the relationship? So did you see, and I think it comes to the Colonel's point about strategic communications and public information. Did you see in Mali that the mission was doing things well? What worked? What the examples are of that? Because for the current constellations in the field, it seems like there needs to be some lessons drawn for that. Thank you very much.
Thanks. So in the back, yes. Thanks.
Hi, Jordan Street from Safe World. I just want to pick up on one of the points and then ask a question from Colonel Decombe. So you say that maybe it's better to call it partner rather than parallel because of how it's acting in practice. I think Naomi's points maybe show, and some of the points from Alexandra, the distinction that needs to be made why we call it parallel, and it's the role of impartiality. If you call a force partner, you are then de facto being seen with the same force. And I think that is a serious risk for UN peacekeeping, and the reason why we probably need to be careful and maintain the parallel distinction. Then the other question goes to your priorities for MINUSMA. The 2 that you kind of indicate at the end were training and equip local forces and strategic communications. So I wonder if there's stuff on the political role that you could share and talk about, because the record with train and equip in places like Mali and Somalia hasn't been that great. So I'm wondering if we make that the focus of MINUSMA or the strategic priorities you say we need to focus on, we're missing a trick with the political elements.
Thanks. Yes, and then on the left. Okay, sorry.
Hello, Colombe de Nicolai, DPPA, DPO, Mali IoT. I also wanted to react to Colonel Decombe's point about capacity building of the MDSF. This is, we all convinced that restoration of state authority is the way forward and the eventual exit for MINUSMA in Mali. However, over the past few years, we've had this debate with the Council about focusing the mandate and, with our limited resources, make sure that we make a difference where we have a comparative advantage. As part of this discussion, we collectively thought, okay, the EU has trainers, it knows how to do this, it's doing it well, and we leave this field to the European Union while we focus mostly on the implementation of the peace agreement. So I'm curious to hear your views. You've served in MINUSMA. Curious to hear your views as to why you see things differently and how you would see the way forward.
Thanks, Michael Harsh, Boston University. First of all, I wanted to congratulate you on this report. I've worked on this issue for many years, and it's really an area where there's not a lot of analysis and research, so it's really filling in a crucial gap, I believe. I also want to applaud the plea for greater cooperation among these missions. I had this brief conversation with Jake beforehand, and we talked about an event that took place about a decade ago, I think, between the NATO Defense College and CIC and IPI, and the language sounds quite similar, to be frank. So I think, I hope we're making progress, but to me it always comes back to the point: everybody likes cooperation, coordination, but no one likes to be coordinated, right? That's just not what organization states like to do. And so I think if you have 5 operations as a rule of thumb, that's maybe 2 or 3 too many, just from sheer organizational point of view, just making cooperation work. So my main question is, I totally agree with the need for clearer division of labor among these missions, but what can be done in terms of actual capabilities, in terms of resources that these missions have? Because one of the things that I found when I looked at NATO UN cooperation, where this resource imbalance is particularly strong, that unless you have some sort of balance between these missions, there's just no incentive to reach out to other missions, to share information, to really make cooperation work. I mean, I think, for example, Kosovo is a good example where where it took UMIC many months to actually deploy a police force, and then KFOR took essentially over security, law and order, not just security, but law and order, and it didn't work out so well. And it got much better once, a year basically after the start of the mission, the UN police actually arrived and reached full force. So I think thinking about, okay, how can we not only divide the labor, but then also provide each organization or operation with the necessary capabilities to fulfill its task within this divided labor. I think that's another, and I think much more tricky question, and maybe that couldn't be addressed in the second report. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think I'll go back to the panel. There are a lot of questions and only 3 minutes each. So maybe, Colonel, if you want to start, there are a lot of questions on MINUSMA, Mali, and your perspectives on partner operations.
I'm the lucky one. Thank you very much, Namie. Yes, many questions, and among the 3, both of them were a bit linked. So I will try to summarize and to make a common analysis regarding your question. Regarding the first question, I fully agree. The question how to deal with the current situation, where UN peacekeeping operation is working very closely with different actors, and I fully agree when you say that sometimes there is you were talking about the situation in Gao. Of course, there is a big risk of confusion in the local population, and that's why I stressed in the end of my speech the importance of the perception and the endeavor that should be made by MINUSMA regarding its own mandate, and making very clear that definitely it's not a counterterrorism mandate, because another force is doing that job, and they are working on a complementary manner, because at the end of the day, the final objective is to stabilize the country and to implement a political process. I would like also, in terms of perception, I would like also to draw to your attention an important aspect from my opinion is the linguistic problem. MINUSMA and many UN peacekeeping operation is not a critic, but it's a reality. On the ground, you were talking what's happening on the ground. Sometimes you have a contingent who have, like me, have an awful English efficiency, but they don't speak French. And when you operate in a remote area, and you don't have any in this contingent, you don't have any even the leader of this unit is not able to speak French, of course, you don't have any communication between the UN peacekeeping mission and the local population, so you cannot explain what you are doing, why you are intervening right now, and why Barkhane is going after that. There is no communication. So the linguistic problem is something to take into consideration. Partiality, I fully agree. It's a sensitive issue. So it has to be taken into consideration both by of course MINUSMA as a UN peacekeeping operation, but by other actors as well. It should, because of this main peacekeeping principle, it should not prevent the different actors working together, from my point of view. Being aware that in this regard, a UN peacekeeping operation has some limit, of course. So that's why, once again, it's a question of communication. The partiality is affected when things are not very clear, where mandates are going too closely. What we should explain and demonstrate at all levels is the complementarity. Complementarity does not mean identical or exactly the same mandate, of course. So it's a question of more of communication rather than questioning the existing disposal or coordination on the ground. Maybe I can give the floor.
Thank you. Naomi, if you want to continue.
Thank you. Maybe just a couple of points. So I think the issue of public information and strategic communication is an important one. I think it's not the only issue though. I mean, I think you can have the greatest PI campaign and so on, but if you see actions on the ground that suggest to you that people are working, you know, hand in glove, or that kind of suggest that there's a conflation of actions, then like it doesn't matter how good your strategic communication campaign is. So I think it needs to go a little bit beyond that. But I do think on public information related things that you know, MINUSMA in particular suffers a big challenge because on the one hand, you know, part of the population has the expectation that MINUSMA will be much more robust, will, you know, go out there and kill the terrorists, and then on the other hand, it doesn't really have that sort of mandate, and you know, there's another segment of the population that feels that it should be otherwise. So there's also kind of a sort of a political management issue that comes into bear. And then maybe just a word on the issue of the terminology and on partners. I mean, I think, you know, the UN and, you know, Barkhane or the G5 all have very distinct mandates, and the reality is we do work in the same theatre, and there has to be a level of coordination and collaboration that somehow has to happen. So, you know, we are in fact partners actually. I mean, whether we like it or not, that is a reality. But then how you manage the optics and how you manage the communications, I think that's where, you know, clear messages need to be sent out in our actions and through our strategic communication.
Thank you, Naomi. Alexandra?
Thank you. Yes, I think that the coordination is the key issue. At the strategic level, our member states have different policies, whether they evolve in the UN, in NATO, in EU, and sometimes that is reflected on the field, and the same member state don't see what's going on really in the field, and the way mandates can be perceived differently by those different actors, and also it depends on leadership. Sometimes, you know, you have leadership that do not want, for whatever reasons, to cooperate with what are supposed to be their partners. And so it's very difficult to navigate among all this and to try to have somehow a coherence. So I think coherence comes first with acknowledgement of that particular challenge, But we know also that the international community has difficulties in learning lessons of past mistakes. So I have no clear answer on that particular problem, except to be more aware of that issue, and to understand that this has consequences on the ground. Thank you.
Thanks. Before I give the floor to Lisa, I think Colonel, you had a point that
Thank you. I owe a reply to Colombe on a more complementary. If I have well understood the question, it was what, in terms of capacity building, what a UN peacekeeping operation could do more. I think regarding, I have two examples. Training is more EUTM responsibility in Mali. The problem is that what EUTM is doing is absolutely fantastic. They are training very well the new recruits within the FAMA, but they have a difficulty to track and to check if the FAMA recruits and soldiers, if they are well deployed on the territory and in the specific job for what they have been trained. You see, because UTM is not deployed on the ground in whole territory. They have reflection on that, but so I have in mind the fact that MINUSMA could take the relay, could support EUTM in checking that the Ministry of Defense of Mali is doing the job and is deploying effectively the recruit and the new soldiers on the right place, on the right job, on the right position. The second aspect is concerning, so we have dealt with training now regarding equipment. It's part of the capacity building. In Mali, you have so many actors, private, public, international actors, and for a government like Mali, it's very difficult to manage all these actors. So what the UN is doing very well is coordination, and I think in terms of this aspect of capacity building, having a new equipment and adapted equipment. I'm not saying that MINUSMA should work with private companies or no, but should assist the Malian government in managing the various actors providing this kind of capacity.
Thanks, Colonel. Lisa, you have the word of the end.
Thank you very much for those questions. I'll be brief. I might go back to the last question that was asked about resources, although I don't think I have a good answer on that, but it might come to the question a little bit that Charlie answered. I think there are sort of two questions here. One with parallel forces is, first of all, whether the parallel force is undertaking a task that could effectively be part of the peacekeeping operation. And in that regard, I'll come back to that in a minute, but if it isn't undertaking a task that could be part of peacekeeping, that is a counter-terrorism force, or it goes well beyond those three principles, then I think some important questions need to be asked about whether the UN presence is fit for purpose. That is, should it perhaps be a political mission instead of a peacekeeping mission? Because I think as our report goes through, when there is a peacekeeping mission deployed, you see a lot more challenges between the way they interact with a very robust counter-terrorism force, as opposed to perhaps some of the cases where it's been a political mission. And that's not to say, if you look at the Afghanistan example, that it necessarily works and isn't without challenges, but I think it brings up a whole new set of challenges when you have peacekeeping undertaking what appear to be very similar tasks to the parallel force. And I guess this comes back to what Naomi said and Charlie's question about perceptions there. So I think that's a question there. But the second question I think is around, if the parallel force is undertaking tasks that effectively could be part of a UN peacekeeping mission, then we have a real challenge there about peacekeeping itself and investing in reform of peacekeeping and strengthening peacekeeping. Why would countries have a preference to be deploying an operation alongside and not invest in UN peacekeeping? And I think this has been an ongoing question over the last 3 decades as well. So I think there's some important questions there to look at. What are the things that a parallel force can do better, whether it's the crime crisis response, whether it's the preference of member states on some issues that reforms that perhaps need to be looked at in terms of strengthening UN peacekeeping as well. And again, that comes back, I think, to how things are resourced. And obviously it's a very challenging budgetary environment at the moment, but I think they're important questions that we probably didn't have the scope to get to in more detail in the paper, but perhaps are out there for an ongoing discussion.
Thank you, Lisa. Well, I think we were running out of time, but we had a very fruitful and fascinating discussion on parallel forces. I highly recommend to read the report, which is the first report of this kind on parallel forces, and that also recommends that subsequent studies should also be made, and lessons learned should continue to be collected. So I think it's going to be the launch of a series of thinking, reflection, and research on this. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you to everybody who attended the Policy Forum today. Please join me in thanking the speakers.